Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolitan Republican Club's webinar series. My name is Krisha Lenzo, and on behalf of the Met Club board, we are so happy to have you join us tonight. As a reminder, we have a donation link in our live chat, and we hope you'll consider making a contribution to help promote events and content like this. Tonight, we are excited to have Miranda Devine. Miranda is an esteemed New York Post columnist and Fox News contributor. She is an Australian-American born in Queens and grew up in Tokyo and Sydney. Miranda is a graduate of Northwestern and has a degree in mathematics. She has also been a reporter at the Boston Herald. We are especially excited because she is one of the crack investigative reporters who has literally broken some of the most important stories in our country right now. She has reported on key issues surrounding the cover-up in Wuhan by the CCP, as well as many of the missteps that occurred by the WHO and Dr. Fauci when attempting to discuss the spread of COVID in our country. Not to mention, she broke the story on Hunter Biden's laptop, which, as we all know, the media tried to cover up and suppress the New York Post article. So tonight, our conversation will cover many of these topics. Of course, we'd love to have her on for longer, but we'll also discuss the overall bias in the media and against conservatives at this time. So with that, I'd love to welcome Miranda.
Thank you so much, Krisha, and hello to everybody out there. It's a great honor to be here with you tonight.
Well, thank you for joining us. So wanting to discuss your recent article, we obviously have many, but the two on WHO and on Dr. Fauci. This is major news that you've discussed in both of these pieces. But first, Dr. Fauci was very late to the game when it came to even talking about COVID, bringing it on our radar and bringing attention to the issue, relying on Chinese data, which we all know even GDP numbers are skewed. So why is it that Dr. Fauci in many ways was negligent with respect to reporting on COVID to the United States?
Look, I think he's a lifelong bureaucrat. He's really more of a diplomat and a politician to get to the top of these Washington bureaucracies. Those are the skills that you need. And he, therefore, was very trusting about other bureaucracies, such as the World Health Organization, which is not the same organization it might have been when it was set up with, great hopes for bringing together the whole world in a joint venture to keep us all healthy and to prevent pandemics. In fact, what's happened is the World Health Organization, through its China-backed leader, Tedros, has just become another arm of the Communist Party in China. And so what they did during the pandemic is absolutely murderous. It's just such an abdication of responsibility. They took the Chinese line. They pretended at a crucial time early on in the pandemic that it didn't spread from human to human. Now, I've spoken to a lot of virologists, and they say that if the World Health Organization had just stated the bleeding obvious, because it was obvious to so many people who were looking at what was happening in China, that, you already had, I think, 10,000 people infected in Wuhan. Of course, it was spreading person to person. The World Health Organization just was trying to cover up for China. And unfortunately, people like Tony Fauci just haven't really faced up to the reality of who at the moment and the sort of organization that it's become, and that it's really dangerous to world health. And so I think that's the first problem. He was lulled into that belief that the WHO was going to be telling the truth, and he didn't really have to, use his brain or his common sense in any other way. But, the fact that he sat in, as late as January 21, he was telling Americans on television that this virus in China was nothing to be worried about. Keep a watching brief, but it's not going to be a problem for Americans. And the way he speaks, which with such authority and such self-confidence, unless you know that he speaks very loosely and flip-flops a lot, which we now know, you can kind of start to trust him and think that, well, if Dr. Fauci says it's okay, it must be okay. On January the end of January, say 28, 29, one of the President Trump's advisors was a guy called Dr. Peter Navarro, who some years before had written a book about China, warning that a pandemic could come from China and kill millions of people around the world. And he, when these reports were coming in from Wuhan in late December and throughout January, his ears pricked up and he became increasingly concerned. So he wrote a memo. He was asked by the White House, by President Trump, to write a memo that would persuade the people who were on what would then become the White House Coronavirus Task Force, this embryonic body that Dr. Fauci was the lead brain on, to try and persuade them that stopping flights from China was a sensible thing to do. And at that point, I think there was something like 10,000 people from China who were flying in every day, mostly through JFK. So Peter Navarro went into the Situation Room and he gave a pretty powerful presentation, the way he tells it, saying that we need to stop those flights immediately and also quarantine any American citizens who do come back in from Hubei province, which is where Wuhan was, just for the 10-day, 2-week period to make sure that they're not infectious. And this had not been done for, I think, 50 years at least. So he went in, and the way he tells the story is that the person who was the most vociferously opposed to any travel bans was Dr. Anthony Fauci. Wow. And he didn't really have any logical reasons. He just kept on saying, travel bans don't work, because that was sort of the mantra of the World Health Organization at that time. And you then heard Joe Biden, who, of course, then was, just a Democratic candidate. He went so far as to describe the travel ban that President Trump ended up placing on China on January 31st, describing that as xenophobia. So did the World Health Organization. It was a very unpopular decision and a very difficult one to make. And there were a lot of the people around that table, economic advisors of the then president, who were arguing against the travel ban because they said it would cost the airlines a lot of money. But the way Peter Navarro put it, you had several options. One is if there wasn't a problem, you lost a few $1 million to the airlines. If there wasn't a problem and you did nothing, no problem. If there was a problem and you did nothing, it would be trillions of dollars in cost and many tens of millions more people dead. And so I think it was definitely the right decision. But there was your first quite sinister clue that Dr. Fauci's expertise and his advice to the government really was going to be faulty.
And to use your words exactly, in many ways, he's been a flip-flopper. Is this kind of quality in terms of what he's been reporting to our nation? Is he acting like more of a politician than a scientist, in your opinion? I think we know the answer, but wanted to hear a little bit more.
Look, I think he is, and I'm sure he means well. He's just doing what he's always done, and it's really all care, no responsibility. He, for instance, just the last few days, he was asked about this double masking idea. There's no evidence, no research to say that double masking is going to protect you any more than single masking if you wear your mask properly. And he just went along with it and said, sure, why not? It sounds like a good idea. And then he had to reverse himself when, some more sober minds came out and said, look, there's just no evidence. Because what happens is there are a lot of people in this country who look to Dr. Fauci and trust everything he says. He has a huge fan base. He's very good at media appearances. And they believe that everything that comes out of his mouth is gospel. And that leads them to perhaps become more neurotic than they need to be. And it's really not a somber, sober, sensible way to conduct yourself when he keeps on giving advice which turns out to be wrong and that he has to second guess himself on. And to be fair, at the beginning of this pandemic, no one got it right. There was a lot of contrary advice. But I do remember that in March, he was saying very strongly that there was no point wearing masks, that you don't need to wear a mask if you're just an ordinary person.
Right.
And it took him 3 months to admit that he lied. And, you know, from his point of view, it was a noble lie. He said he lied because he wanted to make sure that those N95 masks were kept for, you know, frontline health workers. You know, his entire attitude is to treat the American public like fools who need to be shaped and lied to and manipulated so that they follow public health, you know, what he deems at that moment to be the correct public health stance. It would be much better, I think, in a democracy to trust people with the evidence. And, you know, you're a scientist, you're supposed to give all the evidence and the pros and the cons. And lying to people is so bad because I think Dr. Fauci, with his lies, that's not the only one, has really diminished the faith of the public in expertise, in scientific expertise, at a time when we really need to have faith in that expertise. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with saying, look, the science is not settled yet on this, or there are contrary opinions, and this is this, and my personal opinion is, yes, you should wear a mask. I mean, just be honest with people. He also admitted to lying more recently over herd immunity. He began by saying, oh, well, you know, when enough people are vaccinated, it'll be probably 60 to 65% of Americans vaccinated will give us herd immunity. And then, you know, a month or so later, he says, well, actually, you know, I didn't think the American people were going to be so enthusiastic about taking on the vaccine. So I fudged the figures somewhat. And it's really not 60 to 65%. It's more like, you know, 85, 90% of people need to be vaccinated for herd immunity. Well, what is it? You know, the blithe way that he admits to lying is astonishing to me. It just speaks of you know, maybe a profession, the public health doctors, who maybe this is part of their culture, that they lie to people in order to achieve the sort of public health outcomes that they want. But it's a very malevolent way of viewing humankind. And, you know, even more alarmingly, I think today, Dr. Fauci has just announced, he doesn't really announce anything, he just sort of says it off the cuff, that we'll only achieve herd immunity if all children are immunised. Now, that's just come from nowhere. There's no evidence in the latest sort of pronouncements from the Biden administration. There's no mention of vaccinating children. In fact, they say, well, research still needs to be done on the efficacy of the COVID vaccine with children. You know, there just isn't the evidence there that it works or that it's safe for children. And there's no need. I mean, the people who are most at risk, all the science tells us, is the elderly, mainly the elderly, and people with comorbidities. But, you know, your young people are shown to be their fatality rate is next to nothing. They are fine. They do not spread it. We know that children actually are not super spreaders, as it was thought at the very beginning. In fact, the opposite. They spread the disease. They're much less infective than adults. And yet, you know, this is the whole tragedy of keeping schools shut and the teachers' unions refusing to get their teachers back to doing in-person teaching, is all based on this false science, which is that children are somehow vectors of the disease and that schools are dangerous places. Schools are probably, you know, about the most safe workplace you could find. And there's really no valid reason for teachers not to get back to doing in-person schooling, especially as we know the great harms that are falling on children. And I think this is another place where Dr. Fauci has failed. He's been basically silent. I mean, he could have had an enormous impact on just stating what the science is and saying that there is no reason for these teacher unions to continue to hide behind, you know, falsehoods. But he never says anything definitive, and I think it's, you know, a huge disappointment, and really a very dangerous situation. And I also find that his partisan politicking since Joe Biden has become president is really quite repellent. He said that he felt liberated now that he was working for Joe Biden and not Donald Trump, and that you know, he was asked by, I think, CNN whether a lack of candor from the previous administration led to more people dying, and he said yes, which is astonishing because you know, you can accuse Donald Trump of a lot of things, but a lack of candor is not one of them. If anything, he suffered from an excess of candor. He talked all the time. As someone has just described him as having Tourette's. He just spoke whatever was on his mind.
Right.
And the fact is that the Trump administration followed to the letter the advice, the medical advice, the scientific advice in closing down the country, etc., that was given by Dr. Fauci and the coronavirus task force. And they also did lots of other things, you know, very good things, such as Operation Warp Speed to bring the vaccines on, and, you know, commandeering the manufacturing infrastructure in the country to, you know, manufacture our own PPE and so on. And so for Anthony Fauci to now turn around and sort of act like this sort of woke scientist who has been muzzled throughout the Trump administration is just doesn't pass the sniff test.
Definitely. And we're grateful to you for holding him accountable for all of these reasons. Obviously, there's a litany of reasons, but what's it going to take for the general public to hold him accountable? And is that even possible that he will be ultimately held accountable for what we are currently experiencing?
Look, I'm not even sure that holding him accountable is really an issue. I mean, he's been a loose talker. He hasn't spoken with authority. He's flip-flopped. But, you know, none of that is a impeachable offense, I guess. I just would hope that the Biden administration, the people behind the scenes, understand enough about Dr. Fauci to know that they shouldn't rely on what he says as holy writ. And I think in terms of the American public understanding that that what he says is unreliable, that really depends on the media. And unfortunately, the sort of Democrat-friendly, Biden-friendly establishment, maybe elite media, the New York Times and CNN and so on, they worship the ground Dr. Fauci walks on. You know, they have built him up into a national hero. You know, and he's drunk the Kool-Aid. He loves the attention and the adulation. You know, he's photographed beside his pool wearing cool sunglasses, and you know, he's just basking in this adulation. And unfortunately, people who don't read deeply or read conservative or more factual, you know, newspapers and media sources, they're never going to really know about Dr. Fauci. I mean, maybe it'll occur to them that Dr. Fauci is sort of saying you should double mask one day and you shouldn't the next day, but it all just gets blurred into the avalanche of information that we all have. And you know, people are pretty trusting about who is held up as a national treasure, and I guess they're going to trust that that's what Dr. Fauci is. All I would say to anyone listening is just take what he says with a grain of salt. I would go elsewhere, to the CDC perhaps, to more reliable scientific sources.
So now turning towards Dr. Fauci and the funding of the Wuhan lab, which you've written about as well. Some people, it's not really being reported as much, but if you could explain how the company EcoHealth Alliance received some of these government grants, taxpayers' money, to do dangerous, in fact, banned functioning overseas, and how these experiments happen at the Wuhan virology lab.
Yes, well, EcoHealth Alliance is a non-profit based in New York, and it's run by a man called Peter Daszak, who is actually a Briton. And he is, strangely enough, the only American representative in Wuhan today. as one of the World Health Organization investigators, which are supposed to be there to dig into the origins of this virus. But they so far have not gone to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which every reputable virologist in the world says is the most likely source. And the problem with Dr. Peter Daszak, who's been funded by Dr. Fauci for many years, is that he has a conflict of interest because he worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He co-authored papers with the woman who the Chinese virologist called the Bat Lady, Xi Zhengli, on several bat coronavirus papers, and was helping her with her research and funded the lab to the tune of, I think, about $1.6 million that he had funneled through from various sources he had, including the outfit, the NIH group that Dr. Fauci runs, which is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So, and Dr. Fauci and Dr. Daszak were funding a type of research into viruses, which is called gain of function research, which is really a very dangerous Frankenstein style interference or genetic engineering, manipulation of the virus to make it more infective of human cells. So the way that virologists explain it is that a bat coronavirus is not going to be particularly jump species to humans. It's not going to be very infective. Now, there was in 2013, 2014, an incident in a mine in southern China, which is about 1,000 kilometers away from Wuhan. And there were 6 miners who were meant to be cleaning bat poo out of this cave, and they became ill, and 3 of them died. And they became ill from inhaling huge quantities of bat poo, which meant that they got a sort of a SARS-like virus, which killed 3 of them. Now, they got very sick from this coronavirus because they had so much of a load in their bodies, but they were not infective to anyone else. None of the doctors or the nurses who treated them got sick. But the Wuhan lab thought that this was an interesting coronavirus because it had ultimately managed to infect some humans. Mm-hmm. So they were operating on it and doing all sorts of research on it, as well as other coronaviruses that they uncovered from caves and so on. And they were doing gain of function research on these viruses. They've written papers on it. It was all in their database. And Peter Daszak was writing papers with them. Now, it's odd that when the pandemic broke out, and when we know that it was in about October, the State Department has told us that in about October there were researchers at the Wuhan lab who fell ill, and we know that by the end of December that there were people with a pneumonia-like illness turning up at hospital in Wuhan, and it seemed to have started to spread. And then we know that the Chinese government basically arrested doctors who were being whistleblowers online, arrested journalists who were trying to investigate this, disappeared people. There was a cover-up at the Wuhan lab. We also know that from basically internet sleuths who have gone into the database and dug in and found that it was altered on about the 31st of December, which is about when Dr. Xi Zhengli was informed about these people falling ill. And she gave an interview to Scientific American about that time, saying how horrified she was at the thought, her first thought when she heard about these illnesses was, oh, did it come from our lab? So that was her first thought. But since then, she said, oh, no, there's absolutely no way. I've checked the viruses. There's no way that it could have come from our lab. Well, you know, the closest virus that's been discovered to the coronavirus that has caused this pandemic is in the Wuhan lab. But now, of course, they took down their database, and they don't seem to be allowing the World Health Organization investigators anywhere near it. And at the same time, you have Dr. Fauci and Peter Daszak, who have been the most vociferous opponents of the so-called lab leak hypothesis. And Peter Daszak managed to persuade about a dozen colleagues to write a letter to the Lancet saying that this virus had to be zoonotic, which means of natural origin, that it jumped from, just in the wild, it jumped from bats to some unknown, second animal, and then jumped to humans and then spread through the Wuhan seafood market. But there are lots of reasons that virologists around the world have come to believe that that's not a plausible explanation. And one of those reasons is that the virus really didn't mutate all that much. I'm told that if it had leapt from some intermediate animal into humans, it immediately evolves rapidly to suit its or to fit its human host. And it's really been remarkably stable. So that's one clue. It's not proof, but it points you in a direction that this might have been manufactured in a lab and was already primed for the human host when it emerged. And then another thing that people tell me, virologists tell me, is when you actually look at the coronavirus, you see that it is almost perfectly, there are two elements that have been introduced, or look as if they've been introduced, and they've been introduced so perfectly that it's looks as if it was done by human hand. Not, nature is much more messy when mutations happen. So it's as if in the lab it was forced to become adapted to human cells. And in fact, that kind of forcing is gain-of-function research, which was done in the Wuhan lab. And just one other sinister addendum. Back in about 2014, the Obama administration banned gain-of-function research. And they did that because about 100 or more really reputable scientists wrote a letter and had been lobbying to stop gain-of-function research because they thought that it was too dangerous, that mucking around with viruses, no matter how much safety you try to impose on labs and security and so on, humans make mistakes and lab leaks are common. So they resolved that it was too dangerous to be doing this and that we were just inviting a pandemic. So the Obama administration, to their credit, took that advice and banned gain-of-function research, at least in America. But Anthony Fauci and Peter Daszak just took that research offshore and funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology to do that very gain-of-function research that was banned in America. And the tragic irony of that, just to finish up, is that, in order to make us safer, the Obama administration banned gain-of-function research, but the effect of that was to put it into a Chinese lab where the safety and security was subpar. And we know it was subpar because the State Department a few years earlier had done a snap inspection and wrote a report with some horrifying breaches of biosecurity. And even the Chinese government was concerned about biosecurity measures at the Wuhan lab. So that's the tragedy. And we don't know for sure that this virus came out of the Wuhan lab, but certainly that's the most likely culprit. And the fact that the WHO investigators don't seem to even want to go to the lab and even are saying, I heard Peter Daszak the other day in a podcast actually say, it may not even be from China, which is ridiculous. So, I think it's pointless their being there if they're not going to go to the Institute of Virology.
Wow, it's unbelievable what you're telling us right now, and it's incredible. And obviously, again, you're one of the few reporters who's actually covering this in a truthful way. And it's just a lot to take in with even the conflicts of interest. Would you say that it is the case potentially that many of these scientists are not supporting the lab leak theory because it might affect their funding?
Absolutely. I mean, this was what I asked one virologist, and he said that there is a loathing among virologists all over the world, from Australia to the UK to America, to speak up about the lab leak hypothesis, because they're worried that gain of function research will be banned worldwide, and therefore their funding will dry up. And, you know, there is a justification for gain of function research in terms of they use it to try and figure out how a vaccine will work, you know, but I mean, it's not crucial to vaccine work. And, you know, I think if people in the world, people in America were actually aware of how dangerous gain of function research is, there would be an outcry and a demand from citizens of the world to stop it, stop playing God with viruses. It's just, you know, we've had a pretty terrible time with this virus, with this pandemic, but it could be worse. And, you know, we need to make sure, and that's why it's so important to nut out what is the origin of this virus and to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And, you know, it's Chinese people want that as much as Americans do. And, you know, it's not a blame game. It's the Chinese government ought to realize that this is in their interests as well, to allow full access to the lab. And I think people are pretty aware that the virus came from China. So I don't think that they're going to be particularly blamed any more than that. And the cover-up, as always, makes things much, much worse.
So my last question to you is, what is it going to take to form a bipartisan movement where we could expose the truth and also prevent a lot of the censorship that is happening? I mean, First Amendment rights are under siege right now, as we all know, and it's just becoming more and more disheartening every single day.
Look, I think that there is really a crisis in journalism, and you know, I mean, it's ironic for me to say it because I'm an opinion columnist, but there's just too much opinion and not enough facts. And, you know, and it's particularly rancid at the news organizations which are the most esteemed, and that would include the New York Times. And I think we saw just how ideological and kind of propagandistic the New York Times has become with the reaction to the op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, in which he said, ironically enough, he said that during the summer, when there were all these BLM Antifa riots destroying cities, that the National Guard should be brought in, which is a pretty unremarkable thing to say, because that's happened in America's history, and it's currently happening for some reason in Washington, even though there actually isn't any unrest there. But it's quite okay when the Democrats want the National Guard brought in to suit their own political purposes. But when it actually comes to trying to rescue a town like Kenosha or New York or anywhere else across the country that suffered that civil unrest over summer and fall, then you can't call the National Guard in. And remember when Donald Trump called the National Guard in to clear that area in front of the White House in Washington where St. John's Church, that historic church, was firebombed. He was called a fascist. So there's a real double standard here. And so when Tom Cotton wrote this pretty unremarkable comment in the New York Times, there was such an uproar that the opinion editor, one of the opinion editors, was forced to resign, basically. And another person who was a brilliant woman called Barry Weiss, who was also part of the opinion editing team, she was soon forced out as well. And she's written some really insightful pieces about her experience at the New York Times and why she had to leave. And what she says is that the New York Times is not the New York Times anymore. It's not what you thought it was. It's now a place where editors can be forced out for running a an opinion piece by a Republican senator. So it's all over. I mean, the whole this whole sort of cult of what do you call it, critical theory and
Mhm.
all the white supremacy and racism theories, they're so destructive to our country. And unfortunately, you know, when they're written in the New York Times, people think that they have an air of authority. It's almost like Anthony Fauci. You know, the New York Times said it, all the news that's fit to print. People still think that that sort of vapor trail of authority that the New York Times used to have it still exists, and it's really almost gone. And we've seen it on everything from the way they covered the Russia collusion hoax for 3 years during the Trump administration, which was shown to be untrue. They won Pulitzers; they should have given them back. To the way they've, you know, covered the coronavirus, the way they've lauded Anthony Fauci, the way they covered the Kavanaugh hearings. You know, they were very happy to run stories that were smearing Justice Kavanaugh as a rapist, given, you know, very little, no credible evidence.
No credibility. Yeah.
No credible evidence at all. Just disgusting to do that to a man. And yet, when the shoe's on the other foot, and a woman, Tara Reid, comes out and accuses Joe Biden during the election campaign, and she did it before the campaign, of having, you know, been sexually inappropriate, or in fact perhaps sexually assaulting her many years ago. He denies it, of course. But you know, her recollections were no less or no more plausible than the many that were aired in the New York Times to destroy Brett Kavanaugh. But there was a protection racket around Joe Biden. So you can just see from just those few instances that I've given you that the New York Times is playing politics, not doing journalism. And it's not alone. The Washington Post is particularly egregious. And, you know, the sad thing is that there are good journalists at the New York Times and at the Washington Post still, but the leadership and the sort of almost the culture of the place, particularly with, I think, the young journalists who've been, you know, brought up in a different environment where truth is relative, and have gone to being propagandized at university. There is a real culture of fear on a news floor, and you know, wokeness is mandatory almost, and so most people just keep their heads down and just try and do their job in their own patch as honestly as they can. But overall, I think it's very corrosive to people's trust in you know, one standard of truth and facts. And I think when they lose faith in mainstream media to be telling them the truth, they then go to dubious sources on the internet. And I think this is why we saw this just terrible influx of QAnon nonsense spreading like wildfire, and infecting a lot of, you know, decent people who really fell for it. And you know, unless the media actually cleans up its game and starts getting into the fact business and gives both sides, we are not going to improve, I guess, the way that our democracy functions.
Wow. So with that, Miranda, thank you so much for being one of the few journalists who is searching for the facts. I know you write an opinion column. That being said, your columns are always factual and provide us with a wealth of information on so many important topics. Every single one is critical for the future of our country at this moment, especially. And we thank you for also covering the story that happened to the Metropolitan Republican Club when we were attacked by Antifa. And your reporting on that really raised awareness to what, you know, happened on our own soil right in front of our building, to make us feel unsafe, and also to make us feel, you know, on the outs and to potentially even harm us. So appreciate that. Where can we find you? A lot of us obviously read your column, but what are some of the ways that we can follow your reporting?
Well, so the New York Post, I write there every Thursday and Monday, and I'm also a Fox News contributor. I write in the Australian Daily Telegraph on Wednesdays, and I am on Twitter at Miranda Devine, on Facebook less so, and I was on Parler Miranda Devine as well.
Well, thank you again, Miranda, for your time and for explaining so much to us. I know I've learned a tremendous amount, and I'm sure our audience has as well. So appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Krisha, and everybody there. Have a wonderful night.
You